Hello, in this video I would like to continue talking about RHIZOME, which was published as a separate book by Deleuze and Guattari in 1976, 5 years before it was included in 1,000 Plateaus. And I want to continue the discussion of the paragraph just after the opening paragraph, the paragraph that was omitted in the final version that was included in 1,000 Plateaus. So in the last video I talked about half of this omitted paragraph, and I want to go on to comment on the second half. First, I'd like to sort of go over what I think are the relevant points in these first two passages. The first paragraph is an answer to the question, who are you and where are you speaking from? Their answer is we're a multitude, we're a multiplicity, and we're speaking from a process of deterritorialization, and implicitly we're speaking from a new ontology, a pluralist ontology. The passage that I commented on last time is an answer, or the beginning of an answer to the question, well, what are you talking about? And surprisingly enough, they begin with a negation. They say, we no longer say much about psychoanalysis. Nothing important happens there. We could, it's plus rien. That's a sort of reinforcement of the idea of nothing. So absolutely nothing is going on there. So anybody who tells you that Deleuze is and Guattari, but Deleuze made it an extra special point in his discourse about his own method, that Deleuze and Guattari are critical of negation, and probably in the same breath that they're against critique. They're not really looking at the functioning of the text, but they're looking more at the proclamations that Deleuze and Guattari make. Anybody can make any sort of proclamation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it really describes what they're actually doing when you get down to looking at what's going on in their text. And I would argue that negation is intensely present all through Deleuze's texts and Deleuze and Guattari's texts, even more so. So this idea of what are you talking about? We're not talking about psychoanalysis anymore, makes me think of an anecdote that I can recount that concerns my initial exposure to Deleuze's seminars. In 1980, I was in Paris, and I attended a fair few of the tail end of his seminar from September, October 1979 to June 1980. That's the school year. So, and this seminar was just chock full of the the sort of stuff you can find in MILLE PLATEAUX concerning minorities, nomads, minority struggle with allusions to the desiring machines of Anti-Oedipus and so on. And then there was the summer break. In fact, I misspoke there. I was in Paris from January 1981 to roughly June 1981. So for roughly the last 2/3 of the academic year. Then I went back to Australia while it was the summer break in France, and I came back at the end of September in 1981. So it was a new school year. I went to the first session of Deleuze's seminar, and I was totally surprised. I arrived early, and there are only about 15 or 20 students present, when all of the last or the preceding school year, the room was bigger, and it was just packed with 100 or more people of all sorts of different ages. So I was wondering what's happening, and Deleuze came in, and he had a big smile, and he explained that this year, so this school year, he was going to talk about the image and the movement image in Bergson, and the idea that perhaps there's another sort of image, a deeper sort, the time image, that could be found from a reading of Kant. And then he said, of course, I'm open to being a thesis supervisor, but only if your work has anything to do with the work I'm currently on. And then you've got to give it to them. They were brave, at least after the first one, because several students got up and stood up one by one and said what they were working on. And it was mainly, it was all stuff to do with Anti-Oedipus and Thousand Plateau type material. And each time Deleuze said with a self-satisfied smirk, or you could call it a wily grin, that's very interesting, but you must understand that I can only take on people whose theses have points of encounter with what I'm talking about now, and that's all in the past for me. I'm not talking about that in the present phase of my work. So there's a concrete example of this sort of change that Deleuze and Guattari are talking about in the beginning of this second paragraph. So obviously after there were once again 100 people who were in attendance, and Deleuze began with Bergson and the movement image in relation to the cinema. This was the beginning of the cinema seminars that lasted 4 years, but none of the students knew that he was going to talk about the cinema, so they were all excited by the previous books and the previous seminars or lectures, but to no avail. They had no points of encounter with the new phase. So when they say we no longer speak much about psychoanalysis, that's the negation of what they were doing before, and the affirmation comes just a little later. It's at the beginning of the third paragraph in the English translation, and it says, all we talk about are multiplicities, lines, strata, and segmentarities, lines of flight and intensities, machinic assemblages and their types, bodies without organs, etc., etc. So all we talk about, that's quite a good translation, but we're missing the echo with this missing paragraph. So if we stick in the missing paragraph, we'll come up with first, we no longer talk much about psychoanalysis, and then they say what do they say? Page 12, so the beginning of the third paragraph for the separate book, we speak of nothing else. So we don't speak of psychoanalysis, but we speak of nothing else than what we've just sort of begun to speak about, and that we're going to list now: multiplicities, lines, strata, segmentarity, lines of flight and intensities, and so on. So there's this change of direction, this entry, this point of rupture, and entry into a new phase, and that's part of their method. They're not going to continue in the repetition and the monotony. That's what they're accusing psychoanalysis of doing, of a monotony of interpretation, a conceptual monotony, a conceptual and theoretical repetition, and they're not going to fall into the same trap of continually criticizing psychoanalysis, or continually proposing their own new version. So what are they going to do, or what is their method? And here they have a methodological reflection. So now I'll read my translation of the next, the second half of the missing paragraph. It's curious, it's strange that the objections that are made to you are ones that slow you down. You can almost say that put on the brakes, or the decelerate. When you try to swim in a river, they put balls and chains on your feet. Have you, these are the questions now that are the balls and chains. Have you thought of this? What do you have to say? What do you make of that? Are you really coherent? Don't you see the contradiction? What a relief. How sweet it is, douceur, to never reply. There is only one thing worse than objections and refutations of objections. That's reflection, the return to, for example, in a book, the return to the previous book. Where are you with that now? Have you really understood Freud? And your last book, have you changed? Faire le point, to make the point, in the sense of to sum up. You could almost even say to show a PowerPoint. How horrible. So that's the translation of the second half. It seems pretty pretty ordinary, run-of-the-mill for Deleuze and Guattari. They have said in many places that they don't like debate or discussion. Soon as somebody says to you, let's discuss a little, you should get up and flee. And they don't like critique as such, as a method. And so you could say that one of their theoretical adversaries is critical rationalism as a doctrine, and as, even among people who don't officially or consciously endorse critical rationalism, the sort of practice that we could call critical rationalism. So they don't like conjectures and refutations, theories and objections and debates. So why not? And their answer is, and here it becomes or interesting, it ties in with what they said in the first half of the paragraph about psychoanalysis slowing us down, and that we need to speed things up to accelerate, that objections are part of all that slows you down. They're balls and chains, or millstones around your neck, you could say. As well, because last time we talked about the idea of the book is to share something. This is the book of we. It begins with we. We have we all over the place, just as Anti-Oedipus begins with it and has lots of occurrences of it. This is the book of we, of sharing, of collective subjectivation, and of being embarked in a process, as on a raft on a swiftly flowing river or at sea. So from that point of view, you don't want anything that's hampering or hindering you. You don't want too much ballast. And so from the point of view of their idea that you don't want objections that slow you down, and you don't want ballast like psychoanalysis, you've got a sort of economics of time and energy going on. So from the point of view of their idea that I'll say just a little later, that we have to quantify writing, there's a beginning of a quantification of writing there. So the idea is somehow that what you gain in creativity, you lose in critical discussion, and vice versa. What you gain in critical discussion makes you lose the same thing, an equal quantity or worse maybe, in creative investigation and invention. And we can ask, is that true? From an economics just considered with respect to time, we can understand Deleuze and Guattari saying, no, that may be interesting, but we have no time. All our time and energy must be devoted to the creation of the work in progress. But at the same time, people could respond and not just respond, but their own practice might show that critical discussion and debate can be a source of new ideas and a source of theoretical and conceptual progress. So it's sort of expressed as a sort of law of creativity, a law of desire and of the flows of desire. And desire here is the noetic aspect of desire. And at the same time, there is a feeling, because they talk about earlier that what they say is not to be taken as having its own objective scope. There's a sort of elitist element. They're saying, oh, how sweet it is not to answer objections. And we do know that lots of objections people make are irrelevant, superficial, quite often based on a hidden agenda that they just want to take you down, and they're not even seriously or sincerely meant. But that's, I wouldn't even know how to put that in terms of percentage, but that's not all of what objections and debate are all about. So maybe there's something deeper going on there, and I think that there's a sort of epistemological point that we sort of glimpse in the first paragraph, where they're using their new ontology, their pluralist ontology, to deconstruct the author, to deconstruct the subject, to deconstruct what it is to do research, and to deconstruct as well the use of ordinary language. So when they compare saying I when they think multiplicity, they compare that to saying the sun rises when we all know that the sun does not rise. It's the earth that turns. There's an epistemological point and a heuristic point. So the epistemological point is the interpretation of your observation language, and more generally your lower level languages, is to be given by the higher level concepts and theories. You don't have the empiricist effect of a trickle upwards that will reduce you to conformism with whatever congealed, fixated interpretation of the observation language is currently in favour. It's more, because this is not an absolute distinction, it's more a trickle-down affair where the higher level concepts give the meaning, and so when you're using habitual language, as they talk about there, revise the meanings of the habitual terms that we employ. So you can have some trickle up. You'll have this trickle down, but because we have many layers, that means maybe ultimately we'll have to change the observation language a little or drastically, but we have this layer cake of languages and the corresponding theoretical concepts. And the idea is that you can't change all of that all at once. It's already really good if you come up with some new concepts that are innovative and fruitful and that are incommensurable with previously existing concepts, and so with previously existing understandings, including observational understandings. So that's one of the reasons that at the beginning we get this idea in the first paragraph that Deleuze and Guattari are using clever pseudonyms to make things unrecognizable and to make themselves unrecognizable and imperceptible. There's a notion of protection. It takes time to build a good research program. So we're into not the economy of labor time, that you can't spend too much time on discussion, you have to spend all your time on creation. There's a second economics of time, and that's the multiple heuristics that you have to put into play to create on all the levels to bring things into adequation with your high-level theory that you're trying to construct and propound. So it takes time to build and to elaborate a good theory, and you can't develop all of the concepts, all of the subsidiary concepts and arguments at the same time. So you need a set of protective measures. And the problem with objections, and what they're doing here is they're placing themselves in the role of those who are being objected to. And they're saying these are ballast, these are balls and chains or slowing down maneuvers or operations, whether intentionally or not. These are things that can stop people from even entertaining a new idea, because it's in contradiction with all the other little old ideas that they've got and that they think should not be disturbed or shaken up or pushed around. So in this economics of time, you need the protective measures, so everything can go on the up and up for the research program that you're trying to invent. So this too, it's a deeper point, but it can be called into question, because once again they're presupposing that all objections are from a sort of out of phase point of view, and I find that it's still structuralist in the type of vision. People can say to you all sorts of things that can get you thinking, even when they're objecting to you, and you don't even have to agree with their objections. or even necessarily respond in the moment, because that's their objection, that you have to respond in the moment when the reply will only be developed 1 or 2 years later, if ever. So that's their point of view when they're on the receiving end of objections. This does not bother them when they're on the giving end. So they make in Anti-Oedipus lots of objections against psychoanalysis, and you would have to apply the same principles. You would have to say psychoanalysis or psychoanalysts don't necessarily need to reply to Deleuze and Guattari's critique unless it's pushing them forward in their own process. And the reply can come much later. One way of seeing the upsurge of Greco-Lacanian psychoanalysis now is that it took all that time, several decades at least, for psychoanalysis to reconfigure to have a type of theory that is not built on replying to objections such as those of Deleuze and Guattari, and they make clear that they're only sort of systematizing all sorts of other people's objections, not based on as its primary motor on replying to those objections, but by following its own internal motor, has got to the point where it can reply to at least some or maybe all of those objections. And the point goes to us now. Can we object to or refute theses or whole theories propounded by Deleuze and Guattari? Sometimes there's this repressive, literal-minded image of thought that says, no, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't criticize them or object to them or try and refute them, because they were against that. They thought that was sterile. Well, our objections may be sterile for them, although they're no longer alive, but they're not necessarily sterile for us. So our objections may well be part of our own process of generating a new development, or a totally new a new bifurcation, or a totally new research program. So there's this idea that you're meant to slowly file away at the chain on your ball and chain, or at the shackle, to free you, and the objections that you might want to make to Deleuze and Guattari can be part of that process, or they can be objections which have a subjacent affirmation to them, and in that case they're supposedly, from Deleuze and Guattari's point of view, quite valid procedures to rely on, amongst others, to go even further in your own research program. Another point, we've talked about objections, refutations. Here they talk about reflection as well. So it's a little paradoxical. I've said this book is a book of noesis, of thinking, and that's what they do. Deleuze is, or Deleuze was, a philosophy professor at Vincennes and then at Saint-Denis university. He wrote books. Guattari, well, he was a practicing psychoanalyst and institutional analyst, but he spent a lot of his time with theory and writing books, not just with Deleuze, but by himself and with his own seminar. So the idea that they condemn reflection can seem a little strange. The answer there would be that they've got a rather technical definition of what reflection means. So basically, there's good thinking which is good, and I'm calling that noesis for the moment. And there's thinking which is bad, which they want to exclude, and they call that reflection. And we're probably quite founded in including critique, objection, and refutation under the more general rubric of reflection, because we only get a partial definition here. They seem to be suggesting that reflection is returning to, going back to, but that's only a first approximation. It's later on that they say reflection is when the one divides into two, and you've got this sort of mirroring relation between the two. So thinking good, reflection bad. And the examples that they give are going back to a preceding book. Well, there's going back and going back. They're going back by a process of extreme compression to Anti-Oedipus and the book just before this, the book on Kafka. And this compression is part of the acceleration that they're advocating. So that's one technique of acceleration. You can totally just sort of forget and move on. And Deleuze is quite happy to do that. In the colloquium on Nietzsche in 1973, in the discussion after Nomad Thought, somebody asked him, are you no longer talking about the surface and the depths that you can find in your discussions in logic of sense? And Deleuze says, no, I'm not concerned about that anymore. I'm more concerned about a full body and the various flows. So already from difference and repetition to logic of sense, difference drops out, and I think repetition too. He's not concerned with that anymore. So when people say that Deleuze is the philosopher of difference, they're not following the sequence of evolution of his work, and they're not quantifying. Maybe when I count the words and the occurrences, that's only the simplest of the applications of this idea of the quantification of writing, but they're missing. They're not quantifying correctly in two senses. One is they're not quantifying the actual words used. So difference drops out. You have the surface and the depths, and then the surface and the depths drops out. And you have the body without organs, the full body, the flows and the intensities on them. and that's important to see. It's important to see the differences in vocabulary and the corresponding reconfigurations and changes of concept. A second failure of quantification, of incorrect or erroneous quantification, is that there's a failure to see the compression, which is, so either you just forget and that's acceleration in itself, or you compress and you take over what you want from your previous discussions and condense that down to a couple of concepts and throw away the rest. So the compression of difference is into multiplicity, and they're not the same. And the primary concept is multiplicity, and that's what we're getting in RHIZOME. So it's not just forgetting difference, it's compressing difference into multiplicity along with lots of other things, so as to refer back indirectly to your past only in view of accelerating your creative path. So that's why returning back, going back, is in danger of being a ball and chain. After so many years of theoretical work, being asked to explain yourself on what you were saying at your sort of theoretical outset when you were just becoming you, is for a thinker a disastrous experience, because you might be trapped into feeling that you must justify yourself. Via Abend, in his autobiography Killing Time, explains how he fell into that trap, and the critiques were appearing all over the place, and for a while he fell into the trap of saying, I don't know who they're talking about. They seem to think they're talking about me or previous me. I don't recognize myself in that, so I have to explain and justify myself. And he came to the realization that that was his previous self, who doesn't need justification as such. It's sort of like quicksand. You're not going to get anywhere when you justify yourself to people who don't want to understand your justifications. And instead of sort of sinking more and more into the quicksand, you must go on and create something else. So after, have you really understood Freud? Well, that's a huge bibliography in itself. And if you've done and finished with whatever you wanted to say about Freud, you don't need to go on with people who are making it their life's work to be a Freudian, a good Freudian, or a Lacanian, to be a psychoanalyst. And they've got all the time in the world to discuss those questions, where you filed away the chain binding you to those whole domains, and you moved on to something else. And your last book, have you changed? So here I think there is a problem, because Deleuze and Guattari, when they change, it's not just like an intellectual spasm. They don't just suddenly spasm into a different set of vocabularies and a different set of ideas. They go through their own process of thinking things through, thinking what's wrong, what's incomplete, and so on. And it would have been good to have had at least some, the most useful part of that process, written down so that we could read it. So it's true that many objections, even the ones that we make to ourselves, are throwbacks to the old set of ideas that we're trying to get beyond. But many of them aren't. We're amplifying, completing, transforming for a reason in many cases, and it would be good to get some of that process. So I can only half agree with this passage. Faire le point, quelle horreur, make the point. So they're not above making points. It's faire le point, literally translated is make the point, but it's stop and summarize. So their point is, given this economy of personal time and energy, and this economy of heuristic, the heuristic stack or layer cake that you're working with, making the summary, taking stock, can only be valid for them if it's forward-looking and not backward-looking, if it's part of the process of going further. They do at the end of Anti-Oedipus, you have the balance sheet for desiring machines. So it's a balance sheet. It is summing up, taking stock. Theoretically, that's a balance sheet, but in fact, it's part of the process of going even further. So summing up, unless it's part of these operations of acceleration, so we said forgetting, compression, mutation, all processes or operations of acceleration, that is to say acceleration of creative flows. If they're not that, then they're worthless from Deleuze and Guattari's point of view. So what I think is that, what do I think? I think that if we read these first couple of passages from the point of view of a pluralist, whatever that might be, I'm leaving it purposely vague, a pluralist ontology and a pluralist epistemology, we can understand more deeply what they're saying, and at the same time we can see their limits. So if I say using a pluralist epistemology and ontology, I'm saying if we understand what they're saying from inside their own cosmology, from inside their own world and world building, once you're inside their world, you no longer have to agree with all the statements that they make about it. Inside the common sense world, people say lots of good, useful, true things, and they make lots of mistakes as well, or they take a limited case scenario for a generality. So it's the same with the world that they're world or worlds that they're building in this book and in their other books. Once you're inside the world, and that's the whole point of the compressed accelerated style, is let's not lose time on the details, although they're very insistent on going into detail, into concrete cases and so on. But that's secondary to the problem of getting into the world and participating in the world building that they're setting up. Then you'll be able to decide what details have to be gone into and what details have to be abandoned.